crowd, but I'm using the mic because we want our friends on live stream to be able to hear everything that goes on. So when we have questions and answers or responses at the end, I will repeat your question so that our friends out in the digital world can hear us. So this is our third night of this cycle on how thoughts create reality. The first night I spoke about how I grew dedicated to the question of whether thoughts are causative, what I call mind metaphysics, or what is sometimes called popularly new thought, or in other iterations, the law of attraction, or the secret, or science of mind. There's all these different names, none of which have particularly taken root in any determined way, and none of which everybody is comfortable with. Certainly I'm not comfortable. But all these ideas gravitate around one central principle, which is that thoughts are causative, which for me is not a dogma, but it's an article of experimentation. In our second session last Monday, we dealt with some very concrete suggestions and ideas about how to test this thesis in your own life. And I gave everybody their special gift, the pamphlet, It Works. Justin, I've given you a copy of It Works, haven't I? Justin wasn't here last week, but he's a dear family friend, and I forced this pamphlet on everyone like some, street corner evangelist. And I do feel evangelistic about it in a certain way, not because I want people to think or believe that everything you visualize and that your emotive mental states outpicture in reality, but my zeal is for you to test that thesis, to make that thesis your own. And you will make it your own in an exquisitely voluntary way, in an exquisitely private way. And in so testing, we as a community of seekers need to share what we found, because I also feel it's very important, and I'll say something about this in tonight's talk, that the spiritual search in the 21st century and in the century that we've emerged from not become a doctrine. I don't want there to be instructions laid down somewhere as to precisely how to visualize, precisely how to pray, precisely how to affirm. I'm trying to provide you with ideals, articles of experimentation, things that have worked for me, things that I think have resonated with the best minds, the best thinkers, the best adventurers within this philosophy, and that come down to us with the weight of testimony behind them. And they're valuable, they're precious. But what you will discover in your own search and in your own use of these things will be that which is of ultimate value, because we are just at the beginning. We're just at the cusp in our generation of experimenting with the question of the mind's abilities. This is a new search. It's an ancient search in the sense that you can find antecedents throughout ancient literature, in the Hermetica, in Scripture, and so forth. But this has taken shape as a kind of very specific psychological spiritual movement, really only over the past 125 years or so. So in that respect, it's new. And we're new. Tonight, which is a culminating episode of this cycle of 3 talks, I want to speak to you about a philosopher who, for me, is the most powerful, most alluring, most persuasive voice to have emerged from the mind metaphysics movement. And his name is Neville Goddard. He's referenced in the title of tonight's talk, Magician of the Beautiful, which is a term that Neville used in a little pamphlet he wrote in 1946 called The Search, in which he had a vision of the individual's possibility to heal, to grow, to produce events by the beauty of his or her own thoughts. And he said, I was functioning as if I were a magician of the beautiful. And he wasn't speaking in some megalomaniacal way. He was suggesting that we all, within us, have this capacity, just waiting to be born, just waiting to be discovered. Neville, I want to say a very brief word about him biographically before I sort of deliver to you his chief idea around which tonight's talk revolves. Neville was born on the island of Barbados in 1905 to an Anglo-English family, not a wealthy family, not a landowning or a plantation family, but sort of a scrappy, large family of 10 kids, 9 boys and 1 daughter. And he was faced with very limited opportunities, he felt, on the island of Barbados. So in the early 1920s, at the age of 17, he journeyed to New York City to study theater, which was his dream. And how different an era this was, You know, today we can't get 30-year-olds out of mom's basement, and this kid at the age of 17 travels from what was at that time a very limited, very tightly parametered environment and relocates himself to New York City at a very young age to try to make a go of it in the theater world. And Neville did have some success. He landed some roles on Broadway. He was part of a traveling dance troupe that traveled through Europe and the United States. He was in some silent films. He was a very handsome man, very angular, handsome. There was an entertainment columnist writing about Neville in 1926, noting his first appearance in a silent movie, and the columnist referred to him as the new Valentino, the new Rudolph Valentino. He wasn't quite the new Rudolph Valentino, but he did have a career on stage and on screen. But he was dissatisfied. He felt he would make money one month and spend it the next. His life was very up and down. He was not able to make much of a living through his work as a dancer and an actor. He worked as a shipping clerk. He worked as an elevator operator. He went without food a lot of the time. You know, it's funny. Today, people struggle. But in the early 20th century, there was a brutality to life. And I am struck that people like Neville, other thespians, this was something Ayn Rand would recall in her memoirs of the 1920s, they would not eat. They would not earn, and they would not eat. And they would go to bed without dinner. I was reading really a wonderful, wonderful biography written by the entertainer Sammy Davis Jr. called Yes, I Can, which he published in 1965. He was interested in some of these ideas. He's an interesting man, much more so than people gave him credit for. And he would talk about being on vaudeville when he was a kid, and how he and his father and uncle would bounce from town to town, sometimes dealing with really very, very serious brutality directed against them by local racists. And there were times where if a theater owner didn't come through or a gig didn't materialize, they would not eat and they went hungry. And that was a fact of life for the performer in the early 20th century. And that was something Neville experienced from time to time. Neville grew interested in the late 1920s, early 1930s in the new metaphysics, everything that we have been talking about for these past few sessions. He grew very aroused by the ideas that were traveling through America and other parts of the world about the mind's causative abilities. And he began to study, and he said he was hitting a lot of dead ends. He was doing things to his body that he felt were mistakes. He would abstain from alcohol. He would abstain from tobacco. Come on in. He would abstain from sexuality. He was a strict vegetarian. It was not so easy to be a vegetarian in the early 20th century. Gandhi tried to be a vegetarian in London when he was living there in the 1890s, and it almost killed him. You know, there was so little that you could really draw upon in a culture that found such practices completely alien. So Neville said that his weight had dropped maybe around 1930 from a healthy, normal 175 pounds to about 130 pounds. And he was experimenting with all this physical asceticism, different occult teachings, but he was getting nowhere. He's just bumping up against walls. And one night, so he tells us, there was a man, an ex-Catholic priest, who invited him to attend a lecture by a figure named Abdullah. Abdullah was a black man of Jewish descent who lived in New York City in the early 1930s, who wore a turban, was sort of a dramatic figure. In some of my writings, I probed and raised the question of who was Abdullah, was there an Abdullah, but Neville writes about him with tremendous vividness, and Neville has written about other things with great vividness that I've researched, and I have been absolutely able to corroborate. Remarkable claims, like receiving an honorable discharge from the Army at the height of the Second World War after 4 months of service, and they absolutely corroborate the public record. Hopefully I'll have time to say a little word about that. Anyway, so Neville walks into this meeting room in 1931, and this figure of Abdullah, who's a black man of Jewish, bless you, he's a black man of Jewish Ethiopian descent, says to him, Neville, you're 6 months late. And Neville, who had this wonderful clipped British accent, said, I did not know this man. Who is this saying to me I'm 6 months late? And Abdullah said to him, the brothers told me you were coming and you're 6 months late. So Neville said that he and Abdullah together spent the next 5 years studying scripture, number symbolism, Kabbalah, the symbolic meanings of the Hebrew language, and mind metaphysics. And Neville said he experienced an awakening. Their teachings arrived at a kind of razor's point in December of 1933, a couple of years after they had begun to study together. What happened was this. It was a story that Neville told for the rest of his life. He was living in a rented room on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where Abdullah also lived. They lived a few blocks from one another. He was sharing a room with a couple of roommates, and he was aching to return to his home of Barbados for Christmas. But he had absolutely no money to get there. And he was ashamed to ask his family for money. And he said, I had worked in the theater for 12 years, and I was a failure in my own eyes. I made a little money, but I spent it as quick as it came in. And after all these years of study, after all this effort, I felt I had very little to show. And he wasn't in touch with his family. He didn't feel he was in a position to ask his family for money, and they didn't have very much money anyway. And he was lonely, depressed, felt like a failure. And back then, before global warming, it actually snowed, so he was living in this gray, icy, windy, snowy city, just dying to be back on the palm-lined lanes of his home of Barbados. And he went to his friend Abdullah, and he explained this problem to him, and Abdullah said to him, Neville, sleep and live as though you are in Barbados, and you shall be. And Abdullah insisted to him that as he walked the slushy, gray, snowy streets of Manhattan, he was to adopt the feeling state that he was on the palm tree-lined little lanes of this beautiful, beautiful home island of Barbados. And so Neville said, I was determined to put this to the test. And he tried. He tried for several weeks. And he experienced no results. And he went back to Abdullah and he explained to him, I've been trying this exercise of yours and I'm getting nowhere. And Abdullah said, I can't hear you, Neville. You're in Barbados. And he slammed his door on him and refused to talk to him. And Neville persisted and persisted and persisted in his exercise. And one day, he received a letter, entirely unexpectedly, from his long out-of-touch older brother, Victor. And in that letter was $50, a beautiful note explaining that the family had been estranged for too long and needed to get together this holiday, and informing him that there was a reservation to sail to Barbados on the last steamship leaving New York City that year. And Neville went down to the ticket office with his reservation, and they explained to him that there indeed was a reservation waiting in his name, but it was third class. He would have to travel in steerage until they got to such and such a point where certain passengers would disembark, and then he could be upgraded to first class. His brother had promised him a first class ticket. And Neville was exuberant. He went back and he told Abdullah, and Abdullah said to him, who said you were traveling third class? You are going to Barbados and you are going first class. And he slammed the door on him again. And Neville returned to his feeling state, and when the day came, dressed in a new suit for the $50 that Victor had sent him, he went down to the ticket office of the steamship company, and there was a first-class ticket waiting for him. So he went to Barbados. He said he spent 3 glorious months there, and he did all these things that he hadn't done in years. He gave up the ascetic living habits, started drinking again. Much later in life, Neville said, you know, I learned I could do all the things I wanted. Smoking, I never got. Drinking, that I got. Neville was a big drinker. But this episode for Neville was not just an interesting twist of fate or a curiosity or a coincidence. He felt it really was an outgrowth of Abdullah's teaching. And it served as a kind of springboard for him. A kind of springboard in which he realized and came to verify through his own lived experience in various episodes for the next several years that if he dedicated his mind to a certain principle in a very specific way, which I'm going to describe to you, things would happen. They wouldn't always happen right away, and there could be a prolonged gestation period. And he used to talk about the gestation period that was natural in biological life. A chicken has a different period of gestation from a horse, from a giraffe, from a human being, from a rhinoceros, etc., etc. As above, so below. There's always going to be a waiting period. But after deep study, this pervasive dedication to reading Scripture, personal experimentation, and 5 years of study with Abdullah, Neville came to the following principle, which he held to and repeated in hundreds of lectures and more than 10 books and various pamphlets and articles produced throughout the rest of his life until he died in 1972 in West Hollywood. The principle is this. This may be the most important words you ever hear. Your imagination is God. Your imagination is God the Creator. And that every reference you encounter to God in Scripture is an encountering of an allegory of your own individual unfoldment that references to God and Christ in Old and New Testament are actually symbolic in every instance of the creative faculties of your own mind. And that those who crafted Scripture, both our own within the Western world and those of other systems, were beings speaking in a symbolic language, not recording history, not recording genealogy, not recording historical events, but crafting allegories of the development of the individual, which are begun in Old Testament and culminate in New with the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, a psychological fact that Neville said awaits every living being, and that Scripture is a blueprint, a psychological allegory of your own development, and the God of Scripture, every time this being is referenced, is a metaphor for your own creative faculties, and that everything you experience, your relationships, your joys, your triumphs, your tragedies, your failures, the very words that you're hearing right now, my presence, the presence of the person seated next to you, everything that you experience is your own visualized emotive states pushed out, concretized. And that I am rooted in you, as you are ultimately rooted in God. That everyone and everything that you touch, feel, see, experience is a product of your own emotive, visual, mental states. You are literally God the Creator. There is not a God outside of us. There is not a creator and individuals. The individual is him or herself, the creator, clothed in the human form and asleep to his or her own innate divinity. And this challenge was, as you begin to experiment with this idea and discover your own creative faculty, more and more will become clear to you that is currently coarse and fuzzy. And you will ultimately come to realize your own innate divinity and the fact that each of us is God, clothed in the human flesh, and that the imaginative power we possess is the creative power, the Word, so to speak, that is written about in Scripture. That which created reality in 6 days is that which you possess as a thinking, feeling faculty right now. And these words are your words. And the only reason that you're hearing this tonight is because your own intellectual creation has brought you to this point. Visualized just in some guy standing here who's rooted entirely in you. Entirely in you. That is Neville's philosophy. And I tell you, what an experience you are in for if you are moved tonight, as I know most of you will be, to go out and start listening to his lectures and reading his books, because he would expound upon and explain this outlook with such elegance and simplicity and purpose. And everything that I've just described to you is his basic outlook, his essential teaching. And he had this extraordinary, and I would say above ordinary, gift to restate this thesis over and over in literally hundreds of lectures, many of which you can find online, more than 10 books, without it ever once feeling like you had heard it before. There was this epic freshness every time he spoke, every time he described his outlook. It was as if he were describing it for the first time, and you were hearing it for the first time. Every time, I've been reading Neville for many, many years. Every time I read one of his lectures, every time I read one of his books, every time I listen to one of his lectures, I'm filled with this aroused sense of possibility. I'm filled with a sense of the truth that he was able to bring to this most radical of theses. He had this truly, truly extraordinary ability to state this case with such freshness that every time it's heard, it's as though it's being heard for the very first time. He made a decision during his career. He permitted people who came to his lectures to record them freely. This was sort of Grateful Dead style, Before the Dead. And he never renewed the copyrights on any of his books. So everything that he did is now in public domain, virtually everything. His lectures, his books, his pamphlets, it all circulates completely freely. So there's been this growing and bounding culture of Neville online, which you will find if you choose to examine and look into his life. So is any of this true? Does it work? That's something you have to experiment with for yourself. But when I first read Neville, I discovered him in 2003 in a book that is called Resurrection, which I think is one of his greatest books. He wrote it in 1966, about 6 years before his death. And I began to experiment with his methods. And I had this interesting experience, which I wrestle with to this very day. Sometimes just extraordinary things would happen. Events would unfold that I never could have dreamt of. And other times, I met with frustration. Let me give you, in brief, one of the extraordinary events. This was really weird and wonderful. I narrate audiobooks, among other things. And there was a book written by an American writer named Dorothea Brande called Wake Up and Live that I rediscovered. It was originally published in 1936. And I wanted to reissue the book, and I wanted to narrate the book. And Dorothea Brande was an interesting and troublesome figure, but she had one core idea, which was that most of us are more frightened of failure than we are desirous of success. And if we can act as though it is impossible to fail, we can discover new potentialities and possibilities within ourselves. So if you're ever in a store somewhere and you see on a coffee mug or a postcard, act as though it's impossible to fail, that's Dorothea Brande. Goethe didn't quite say that. Some variation of that is often attributed to him. He was very wonderful, but he didn't say that. She did. And so she wrote a book called Wake Up and Live, with an exclamation point. I really liked the pioneers of self-help because they didn't hide behind ponderous titles. I like titles like Wake Up and Live and It Works and The Science of Getting Rich. It's like, if you believe it, put it out there and defend it. Don't hide. So she didn't hide. I can say that to her benefit. And I wanted to narrate this book, and the rights were sold to a certain audio publisher, and I had worked with this audio publisher before and had what I thought was a good relationship. And I went to the publisher and I emailed her and said, you know, I would really love to narrate this book. And she was ignoring my emails, which is a frustrating experience. And I couldn't quite figure it out. And so I wrote to her, and I was getting ignored, and I was getting blown off. And it was very frustrating to me, especially because I knew I could do a good job at it, and I had done projects for this person before that had gone well. I didn't know what the trouble was. So I ran into her and I asked her, hey, you know, could I record this book for you? And I don't know what it was. She just didn't like the idea and she kind of blew me off. And I was frustrated and I was perplexed. But I thought to myself, well, this is prime time to experiment with Neville's ideas. So rather than going into the state of gloominess, I adopted one of Neville's methods. And when I'm done with this story, I'm going to walk you through basically a 3-step approach to using his method that I think is uniquely potent. So I adopted a mental picture that had real emotion attached to it that was associated with my recording this book. I really wanted to record this book. And I had been told flat out no. First I was ignored, then I was told no. Being told no is better than being ignored, but I got both. So it was a real bonus. And I was very frustrated, but I didn't give in to that. And I went into a visual feeling state, and I walked around with this feeling, as did Neville with his wish to be in Barbados for Christmas, that this was something I was going to do. This was something I was going to do. And I tell you, I would never exaggerate. I would never stand up here and hand you some line or some baloney or some exaggeration of something that didn't happen. This is what happened. After about 2 weeks of really holding to this, I got a call out of the clear blue from someone telling me the audio rights to that book are no longer with that publisher, the one that was saying no to you. Someone else has made an offer on it, different publisher, and we're selling it to that different publisher. And I said to the person who did this, who was a rights manager, who was handling the sale of the rights, I said to her, would you please go to this other publisher and tell them that I really am dying to record this book? And she said she would. She said she would. Very short time later, she comes back to me, and she said, this other publisher said that he wrote to you to ask you to record a book, and you ignored him. And I said, I did not. You know, I don't do that to people. And so I go look in my spam filter. This guy's email is not in there. So I go look in my super duper spam filter. There it is. He wrote to me maybe 2 weeks earlier. It went into this uber spam filter where nothing goes. I mean, hate mail from neo-Nazis doesn't go into that spam filter. And this guy's perfectly innocent email went into that spam filter. And in that message that I had no idea was there, he was inviting me without any antecedent, without any relationship. I had no ties to the guy whatsoever, to record 2 audiobooks for him. So I went back and I said to him, can I record this book and the 2 audiobooks for you that you'd like me to do? And he said, yes, yes you can. And you can go find it yourself. The book is called Wake Up and Live by Dorothea Brande. And I narrate it. That's the book. That's the book. And that's the company. And that's exactly how the events unfolded. That's exactly how the events unfolded. Now, could it have just happened? It didn't feel ordinary. It did not feel ordinary. I've also met with frustrations as well. You know, sometimes our perspective is off. Sometimes we want to rush into action when we need to hang back. Sometimes perhaps there's a period of gestation. Sometimes perhaps there are other countervailing forces that we don't understand. But that set of events did happen to me exactly as I've laid them out. So, in the name of experimentation, let me give you Neville's method, exactly as he described it. He would use different language and he would use different techniques, but he gave a wonderful series of lessons in Los Angeles in 1948. And in this series of 1948 lessons, I think Neville laid out his philosophy and his teaching with greater clarity and power than he did at any other time. And I distill from what he described at that time 3 steps, and they are exquisitely simple steps. But as we've talked about at other times during these past few weeks, what's exquisitely simple can also be exquisitely deceptive, because you need to be focused on something and you need to feel a sense of preparation to really bring this thing into your life. And what you're trying to bring into your life might have other things that come with it, some of which are very pleasing and some of which are very disturbing, or some of which you just didn't expect and don't want any part of. If you start using your mind in earnest to experiment with things, You might discover complexities or problems that you didn't know were there. We've talked about the question of perspective. Do we have perspective on what we really want? Well, I think we do at very deeply sensitive moments. There are deeply sensitive moments when we're at our best in our relationships, in our jobs, as artists, as beings who have to function in the world of commerce, world of friction. And there are times where we are not at our best and where our perception is lacking and our perspective is lacking. And being able to sort out the difference between those two times can mean the difference between heaven and hell when we're faced with very serious decisions. But I give you this very simple program, and it's something to experiment with. Experiment with it with great care. Experiment with it with great gentleness. Because I believe, as simple as it is, it has tremendous power. And Neville's contention was that we're using this ability all the time. We're just using it in an unconscious way. We're using it in an undirected way. Everything we experience, which might feel very contradictory and very frustrating at sometimes, which might introduce friction into our lives that we may not want. His contention was, well, want it or not, I am the creator. I am ultimately responsible. And I may need to suffer. I may need to stumble. I may need to go through a furnace of affliction, so to speak, which is a metaphor that gets used again and again, especially in the Old Testament. This was the three-part method that Neville gave based on my distillation of his 1948 lessons. He really talked about the art of mental creativity being reducible to 3 steps. The first step is having an absolute, undying, passionate desire. We talked about that last week. We talked about the question of having a definite chief aim. What does it mean to have an aim, a wish that you feel with such indelible depth that you're passionate about it, you're obsessive toward it? I don't think, as I was remarking last week, we use the term obsessive today almost like a pathology, something that has to be diagnosed and cured. I don't see that as necessarily being the case. Should Gandhi not have been obsessive about India's independence? Should Martin Luther King not have been obsessive about universal human equality? David Lynch is obsessive about his movies. He's obsessive about wanting to complete something with absolute perfection. Vladimir Horowitz didn't get on stage and say, well, the piano's not tuned to perfection, but, so what? Artists and people who you want to emulate, personal heroes that you may have, they were all obsessive. They were all obsessive. I once said to somebody, and it's the truth, there are 2 kinds of writers: those who write good books and those who sleep at night. Take your pick. I've never found an exception to it, not in my own life or that of others. So, what is it you're obsessive about? What do you most want in the world? What do you want as much as the next breath that you're going to draw? It's really important to have that passionate, focused desire. And we talked about this last week. Sometimes coming to a place of desire means acknowledging something about yourself that you might not like, that you really, truly might not like. Many years ago, I was friendly with a somewhat famous psychic, and we were in a parking lot somewhere and having a conversation, and she said to me, do you know what you want in life? You want power. And I wanted to push this away. And I thought of her as a person who exercised power in an unethical way. She was kind of a bully. She would manipulate people. She would sort of shove people around. And I thought to myself, I don't want power like you. And she said to me, your problem is you have an overdeveloped superego. And I thought, okay, another interesting conversation in a parking lot. But I was never quite able to get away from what she said. And it's been many, many, many years, and it's haunted me ever since. What is ethical power? What is unethical power? Do I really want that? Is that a trap? Is that true? Is it false? But her question and the demand of coming to achieve aim always put me again and again in front of that challenge. And it's funny how sometimes people that you don't even like sometimes can say something to you that's very perceptive. And you might not like the individual, but they might be right. Or they might be right in some shade, wrong in some other, and it falls to you to sort out what the truth is. But the process of deciding what you want, it could be very uncomfortable, but it also could be very arousing, because as I was saying last week, too often I think we just repeat things to ourselves by rote. You know, we tell ourselves, I like my job, I care about this, I don't care about money, I like this friendship, I like this relationship, I want this. And if you live in New York City, you're always saying, I want my cat to get better, I want a better apartment, I want to level up in terms of this or that career thing. These very common things. But a person who really is frank with him or herself might discover that, for example, somebody who says that he doesn't care about money, maybe he cares very deeply about money and he's never acknowledged that to himself. Or someone who says to herself, I really want to attain, I really want to achieve in my workplace. Maybe that individual wants nothing more than to just be home, in privacy, in solitude, not being bothered by other people. Neville used to say that people talk about wanting such and such a job, and he said, well, do they really want the job or do they want security? They could be two different things. But don't let me sway you, because the job itself could also be something that you really truly want, and that could be a wonderful thing. And one of the things I loved about Neville is that he really reveled in his students' success. He had a lot of students who were in fashion, in the arts, from all different walks of life. And there was one woman, she won a fashion award. This was in the late 1960s, and the award was called the Lulu. And I'll never forget, in that wonderful accent of his, he said, come up on stage, dear, show everyone the Lulu. And she had some kind of award, like an Oscar for the fashion industry. And he really loved to see his students succeed. And there was nothing puritanical about him. He would never tell somebody, don't drink, don't acquire, don't partake in this pleasure or that pleasure. His ethic was that desires are holy, that inasmuch as God desired the creation of all that is, you have desires, those desires too are holy. That puts us in front of difficult questions, because we're also told in Scripture, and I think this is extremely important, we're counseled, especially in the New Testament, in the ways of nonviolence. Read the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes give us a good way to live. If we really believed what we read in the Beatitudes, it would change the world. But do we believe it? Are we capable of believing it? So there has to be something nonviolent in our attainment too. And when I say nonviolent, I mean by that very specifically, not passivity, but not doing anything to deprive another of his or her potential, not violating emotionally or physically or in other ways the potential and strivings of another. So I recognize and I celebrate Neville's point that desires are holy, but we live in a complex web of relationships. And if our desires are violating of another, then suffering must be experienced. Suffering must be experienced. So there's a very serious ethical dimension to all of this. But I'm saying this because I don't want you to feel that in Neville's teaching you would find yourself dissuaded in any way from saying, well, do you really want that part in the play, or do you really want your father to approve of you? You may not care whether your father approves of you, but you really want that part in that play, and that's wonderful, and that's wonderful. Just know what you want. Just know what you want. That's step one, the clarification of desires. Step two, assume a state of physical immobility. Go into a state of exquisite, deep relaxation. Neville would speak of meditation, but he didn't use the term meditation, and we use all these terms in different ways. He didn't use the term meditation precisely in the way that it gets popularly used today. It wasn't exactly a kind of mindfulness, but Neville would see meditation as being a state of deep, gentle, pleasurable relaxation, of the kind that you experience just before you drift off to sleep, bless you, just before you drift off to sleep at night, or just when you're enjoying that wonderful, luxurious sense of sleep that you have on a weekend morning when you're underneath your comforter and you know that you don't need to get up and you don't need to be anywhere or do anything for anyone. Are there hours of sleep that are any sweeter than that? You know? And Neville would speak of this state of drowsiness, this in-between state. We talked about it last week. It's sometimes called by sleep researchers and others hypnagogia, the hypnagogic state. It's this dreamlike state where we still have cognition, but we're just drifting in between sleep and wakefulness, sleep and wakefulness. We experience it just as we're drifting off at night. We experience it just as we're coming to in the morning. Neville would describe that as a meditative state. That's how he used the term. And he said, and there were other thinkers and figures who have said this as well, and sleep researchers have discovered remarkable things that are in congruency with this observation. So have psychical researchers, a whole other topic altogether. But he said that this was the exquisite state of mental creativity. This was the womb-like state of the mind. This was the womb-like state of the mind. Neville promised that your rebirth will come, in effect, from your skull, as Christ rose from Golgotha, the place of the skull. That your birth will come in an emergence from this womb-like chamber that we call the skull, or Golgotha. Also like Minerva being reborn from within a skull. And you are nestled within this womb of consciousness when you are in this drowsy in-between state, this borderland state, this state that Salvador Dali, also a student of mind metaphysics, captured in his paintings when he would paint watches and timepieces bending in these wonderful dreamscapes where perspective and up and down and compass points were all fluid. That's this hypnagogic state. That's this state that you find yourself in. Neville said that the easiest way to attain this state was to utilize the state of consciousness that you're in just before drifting off to sleep at night. But it didn't just have to be then. You could do it any time. He would talk about eating lunch, drinking a bottle of wine, and drifting into a sleep state around 3 p.m. Now, I said to you, he was not ascetic, and he was a drinker, and he enjoyed his booze, and he enjoyed his wine. And I know a woman whose mom used to take her to Neville lectures when she was a very, very little girl. He died in 1972. And she said he was a lovely, lovely, angelic man, exuding warmth and smiling, and he loved his students. And he always smelled of breath mints, probably because he was covering up some alcohol. But, you know, he was very freely, he would very freely acknowledge this without any embarrassment. He enjoyed it. He enjoyed it. And so I'm not suggesting that you necessarily need to go out and use the aid of alcohol, but that was something Neville did. More importantly and more seriously, I think also Neville benefited from the training he had as an actor. He really was very capable of sending himself into different states. Anybody who's been trained in method acting or anything like it, I think would be just a prime student for these teachings, because a person who's trained for the stage and who knows how to enter different states is, in a certain sense, already operating along the lines of Neville's methodology. In fact, Israel Regardie, the occult philosopher who had been a secretary to Aleister Crowley, he met Neville in the 1940s, and he wrote about him. A very long chapter in a book that Regardie wrote called The Romance of Metaphysics. And in this book, Rigardi said he didn't think Neville was attentive enough to the fact that among his students were people who were not actors and were not trained for the stage, and it might be difficult for some of them to enter the feeling states so freely and willingly that he would talk about with such ease and with such grace. But Neville did say that the easiest way, the automatic way to enter this state of physical immobility, which is the state from which we create, which is the womb-like state of the mind, is to use those precious minutes that are available to you every night just before you drift off to sleep. But you must do it before drifting off to sleep, while you still have that measure of control over your cognition. Because that brings us to step 3, which is the mechanism of true creation. And step 3 is this. You have to enact within your head a really pleasing little drama that illustrates the event that you want to come to pass. It should be something very, very simple, so that it's easy to picture, it's easy to maintain, and so that your mind doesn't wander to a dozen and then a dozen more associative thoughts removed from it. So, for example, a woman at one of his 1948 lectures said she wanted to be married. Okay? What kind of emotional drama should she enact in her head? And he said to her, try this, try this. Try just to imagine the feeling and the weight of a ring, a wedding band, on your finger. Just try to imagine the weight on your finger. And imagine yourself twirling the ring around, just feeling its metallic substance, its tactile realness. And that's all. That's all. And then just repeat that drama lovingly, pleasingly, in your head, over and over, like it's a repeat loop. And try to come into the feeling state that evokes in you. Feeling is the secret, Neville said. That was the title of one of his books. He would always tell people, think from the end. Think from the end. What would happen in your life if you had the thing that you want? And what would be some small, elegant, very, very simple, very little basic drama that would emerge from this victory coming to pass in your life? Maybe it would be somebody handing you the keys to a new apartment that you want to move in, and you just feel the very gentle weight of the key in your hand. Or maybe it would be your boss or someone whose opinion you value, shaking hands with you and saying, congratulations, congratulations. But he said that it's very important that you not see the drama as though it's acting out on a movie screen, but you must be in the drama. You must be in the drama. This is happening to you. You're not watching yourself be congratulated. You're not watching yourself be handed the keys to the apartment or what have you. You are experiencing it. He would say, if I want to climb a ladder, I don't see myself climbing a ladder. I climb. I feel the mass of the rungs in my hands and beneath my feet. You must really put yourself in that. And he said, this is the method, this very simple 3-part method. A clarified desire, a state of physical immobility, and the enactment of a personal drama. Very small, very simple, very basic, and just run that in your head as long as it feels fresh and vivid and truthful. And feel the emotions that would go with it. And he would say to people, try this, try it tonight. Maybe it will produce results for you right away. Maybe the results that it produces are off into the future. And he would counsel people, don't try to figure out precisely, gee, how will this happen? How will this unfold? Don't try to create some outline. He said creation always happens in secret. It always unfolds in this remarkable, unexpected way through devices and means that you could never foresee. And your job is not to try to go along cajoling buds to open or chrysalises to open, but just to maintain this personal drama. And this is the stuff of creation. This is from which it arises. And he would say, if you stay true to this, you will, over time, encounter extraordinary circumstances that will represent green lights to you, that will affirm to you that you are on the path of something right and true. And that was his challenge. That was his challenge, to experiment with this method. And as you experience success with this method, you will be moved in the direction of a greater and greater sense of self-realization. You will have illumined thoughts and ideas. You will approach Scripture, the reading of Scripture, with a new and deeper and more penetrating sense of realization of what's in it. That it isn't this book of history and battles, and this being said, and so-and-so begetting him, and so-and-so begetting him, but it is a book of your allegorical development, conveyed in Near Eastern symbolic language, which we modern people have failed to grasp. That was his challenge, and that was his method. So again, we come back to the question, does it work? When does it work? Why does it work? I'm struck that Neville, and I believe strongly, that Neville is, I think, the most elegant writer and thinker and will attain the greatest posterity of anyone coming out of the mind metaphysics tradition from the past century. He was also a writer who had the greatest instinct and created the clearest mystical analog to what's going on in quantum physics research and what has gone on for the past 80 years. And I feel a need to say something about that. Scientists hate when people like me talk about quantum physics because they feel, and I understand where they're coming from, they feel that when New Age philosophers talk about quantum physics, they're cherry picking from very complex ideas, and they're using ideas that people in the hard sciences have debated for 80 years to buttress and reaffirm their most cherished spiritual conclusions, etc., etc. And the truth is, there really are grounds for a serious conversation between mature students of metaphysics and students of physics who feel that if physics isn't in existence to explain reality, then what is it for? And the capacity to carry on that discussion just requires a little bit of patience on both sides. I have written and talked about some of the correlations between mind metaphysics and quantum physics, I think with great integrity. And I try to be very restrained and very careful and very thoughtful in what I say. And I find that there are many people in the world of physics who are coming of age today and who grew up in a world in which questions of consciousness, questions of awareness were encouraged, who grew up on episodes of Star Trek and science fiction novels and books by Carlos Castaneda and by other spiritual philosophers, and who are open to questions of human possibility. There are also some people who feel a very strong polemical objection to anybody from outside the sciences discussing these ideas, as though any discussion itself is going to be in the service of irrationality and magical thinking. And I reject those extremes. I reject those extremes. There are simply grounds for a conversation. And I think that some of the greatest thinkers in physics would say the only people who don't know what they're talking about is those who think they do. That what gets found emergent from 80 plus years of experiments in quantum physics is so challenging of how we have come to understand Newtonian mechanics and above ground macro reality that there's almost no question that it doesn't upend. Neville said this in 1948. Someday, science will affirm the existence of a serial universe. That is to say, a universe in which infinite things are going on all at once. But more important to us is how to use this insight. He said this in 1948, decades before any iteration of quantum physical thought was popularized. Now let me say something about a brief thought experiment that has dominated the quantum physical field that correlates almost remarkably well with some of Neville's mystical ideas, and it's this. Now, very, very briefly, to go through a kind of fortune cookie version of quantum physics experiments, what physicists will find in particle labs is that subatomic particles exist in what's called a wave state and a particle state, and that if you direct subatomic particles into a certain target system, like a double slit, for example, it can be demonstrated through interference patterns that at one point the particles in a so-called wave state existed in more than one place at once. They exist only as a potentiality until measurement is made. They exist only as a potentiality in what is called superposition. Superposition. That's a wave state. When a measurement is made, they collapse, so to speak, into a localized position and are found in one place. So again, you fire subatomic particles, so to speak, at two slits or two boxes. And interference patterns can demonstrate that at one point, any given particle can be found to be in both places at once until a measurement is made, at which point a particle is localized in one place. So this has led to speculation that not only are multiple or infinite things going on at once, but that reality, at least in the particle lab, is not concretized until a conscious observer makes the decision to take a measurement. That is exactly what's been going on in 80 years of quantum physics experiments, collapsed to the most basic example. So, the 20th century physicist Erwin Schrödinger expressed frustration with this state of affairs because he said that the data produced by the quantum physics lab, in which a particle can occupy both places at once, and which seems to respond magically and become localized only when someone makes a decision to look or not to look, it's leading us in these absurdist directions. And Schrödinger wanted to challenge physicists, to follow the extremity of where their own findings were taking them. And so he devised a thought experiment, which some of you have surely heard of, called Schrödinger's cat. This is a variant of the Schrödinger's cat experiment, and it relates us back to Neville. Schrödinger said, if you were to take two boxes, and inside one of those boxes put a cat, and this cat would have around its neck what he called a diabolical device. And this diabolical device would release a poison that would kill the cat when exposed to an atom. Okay? So you take the cat, you put the cat in one of the two boxes. Very simple. And then you fire an atom at the two boxes. The atom is going to trip the device that releases the poison that kills the cat. So you have your two boxes, you have your poor cat, you put him in the box with the poison device around his neck, you direct an atom at the boxes. Well, what happens? Well, all observed experience tells us, the atom either entered the empty box, and the other box has the cat, and the cat's fine, or the atom entered the box with the cat, tripped the device, and the cat's now dead. Wrong. Wrong, said Schrodinger. Everything that we've amassed in quantum physics experiments over the past several decades dictate that both outcomes must be true. The cat is dead and alive. How could that be? Because that atom in a wave state was demonstrably at one time in both boxes. And your decision to look is selecting a reality that you experience, the dead cat or the alive cat. But the facts are that because this atom was in superposition at one time, you must have a dead alive cat. And not only that, but if you were to wait 8 hours before opening up the box to find out what was going on, you would actually have a hungry cat, because you made the decision to wait those 8 hours. You not only created the reality of the dead cat that you experience or the alive cat that you experience, but you've created the past as well. You've created the past as well. Now there's a hungry cat because you waited 8 hours. It's this impossible necessity, said Schrodinger, that both outcomes are true. The cat is dead and alive because the atom is in one box and in the other. But how can this be? How can this be? Here in the macro world, we experience life as one or the other. This chair is here. It's not here and here. This floor is here beneath our feet. We feel its mass. It's not here and here. So why on the level of the subatomic scale is reality so vastly and radically different, according to the Schrodinger's cat experiment, than what we experience in the here and now? Now, one of the possibilities for this, and William James came up with this in 1902 in his Gifford Lectures, which became his book, Varieties of Religious Experience, but quantum physicists talk about this experience, this theory today in the parlance of their own language and have forgotten about William James. Quantum physicists talk about the possibility of information leakage, which is to say that when we are examining something with very fine instrumentation, William James used the example of looking at a cell under a microscope. You see all kinds of things going on. You're getting all kinds of information. But as you pan back and your sensory instruments become coarser and coarser, you see less and less of what's going on. So quantum theorists, without crediting William James, have dubbed this information leakage, which suggests that our sensory equipment is so coarse and so poorly tuned that we do not experience all but the tiniest fraction of what's really going on in reality. And that when we view reality with finely honed instrumentation, William James used the example of a microscope, we see more and more and more of what's going on. So re-enter Neville. What Neville said years before any of this was discussed by the general public is that you're not manifesting reality. You're not creating reality. You are selecting reality. That what you dwell upon in your psyche, what you bring emotional and mental vividness to, is an act of selection. That there are laid before us infinite possibilities of pasts, presents, futures, events that are going on everywhere and all around us in infinitude. And that we are like these individual dreamers, all in our own state of sleep, imagining into being as we crisscross in and out of one another's realities, infinite number of states and possibilities which we select, So in an age before the Schrodinger experiment was widely known or talked about, Neville was really talking about essentially the same thing using a mystical terminology. But what does it matter what terminology you use? As I was saying the first night, show me what ego is. You can't grasp it. You can't touch it. Show me what God is. Show me what inner is, what outer is, what essence is, what being is. These are just terms that we come up with and form some very fuzzy consensus around so that we can speak to one another in generalities, so that we have a way of communicating. Generalities are necessary to communicate. But what Neville is saying about the mental selection of realities that are going on all around us is, at its core basis, no different from the challenge that Schrodinger was issuing in his experiment to physicists, saying, you have birthed into being without intending to this mystical, extraordinary view of reality in which linear events that seem so convincing and so persuasive and as real as the floor beneath our feet are actually illusion, and reality is a dead, alive cat. Things that are impossible, that shouldn't happen, and yet that are dictated as actual necessities because of 80 years of quantum data. They're using different languages. They're using different lexicons. But they're essentially coming to the same thing. So Neville's challenge back in 1948 was science will eventually affirm the existence of a serial universe, but more important than that, our job now is to learn how to use it. So, will you try? Will you test it? That was his challenge. That was his wish. And that's my deepest wish for everyone in this room. As I came to understand Neville's work, I felt like I was standing before, in some ways, the greatest challenge of my life, and yet it was a challenge that filled me with joy. It was a challenge that filled me with exuberance, because it was one of possibility, because it was one that affirmed the nobility of the individual, the primacy and the epic nature of the individual mind. There's no dreariness about it. It doesn't deny tragedy, but it does suggest something about the ultimate heights to which the individual can attempt to climb and to discover. I'm going to conclude on this note. We'll have to come back and we'll do some other nights together. I don't have time to say much about the writer Carlos Castaneda, but he's someone I admire, even though I understand historically his claims have been largely disproven and found to be invention. I think that they were invention in the expression of great truth. And Castaneda was actually influenced by Neville, a fact that's not widely known. Castaneda's wife, Margaret Runyon Castaneda, was a very close student of Neville's in the 1950s. And Margaret first met Carlos she ran into him at a friend's house when Carlos was this very dashing art student at UCLA. And she took a copy of the Neville book, the little book, The Search, which I mentioned, from which the phrase magician of the beautiful is drawn. And she wrote her name and phone number in the front cover of Neville's book, The Search. And she slipped it to Carlos. And they became lovers and briefly husband and wife and had a kid together. And she talked about how Carlos never expressed any great interest in Neville's thought, except when Neville would talk about the presence of his teacher Abdullah, at which point Carlos's eyes would grow wide open and he would listen with rapt attention, and she wondered if maybe Abdullah became a kind of template for Carlos's teacher, Don Juan, as he was introduced to us in the first of Carlos's wonderful, wonderful books. But one of the things that Don Juan says in the first of Carlos's books which I was struck by, is this, that the individual must choose a path with a heart. There are all kinds of paths out there. There are all kinds of possibilities. There are all kinds of places to search and to look and to aspire. But why choose one that makes you miserable? Why choose one that fills you with sorrow and weight? And in a kind of existential stoicism, Don Juan says, look, none of us are going anywhere anyway. You know, there are two paths in life, through the bush or around the bush, and they all lead to the same place, which is nowhere. So you can wrestle yourself with his statement of stoicism, but he said, so if that's the case, why not choose a path with a heart? Neville would not have agreed with him, by the way. Neville would have said, that's actually not true, that there is an enfolding realization of one's own inherent divinity. That is the path that actually goes somewhere. But we'll leave Don Juan to his observation and take this other part of what he was saying, which is this. Don't choose a path that makes you suffer. Choose a path with a heart. Choose a path that summons you to what's greatest within you. Choose a path that fills you with exuberance, with passion. For me, Neville has been that path. And I introduce and offer him to you. And if his teaching is true and is correct, this introduction is not being offered from me to you, but it is from you. And you've come to these ideas entirely of your own volition, and you are the magician of the beautiful. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. And we have about 10 minutes for exchange or questions. And if you have a question, I will repeat it so the folks listening on live stream are able to hear it. Alan.
Yeah. So the Schrodinger's experiment, it's not just about cats. Anything is possible right outside this room. I mean, we can take it and extend it beyond the body. I mean, how far can you go with that?
You were asking, Schrodinger's experiment seems to be a statement of ultimate reality, in a sense. And that was his contention, that we don't live in the simple world of linear events, this and that, black and white, yes and no, that we think we live in, but we live in a world that's filled with an infinitude of possibilities that seem to depend upon what choices we make at any given moment. I mean, it isn't so much that Schrodinger was endorsing that point of view as he was saying we are dragged to this point of view by these facts and theories, and any physicist who doesn't wrestle or grapple with this is fleeing his own data. That was what he was intending to show with his thought experiment. Hey.
When you use terms like infinitude of possibilities or the impossible is possible, with this sort of idea of field of potentiality, the multiverse, is that a little interesting because is it still has to have potential to happen?
Yeah.
It has to be possible. So the impossible is possible, or infinitude, like with Schrodinger's cat.
Right.
The cat is either or both alive or dead. The cat cannot be turned into a rabbit, which would be an infinite possibility,
That's an
or
interesting
the impossible
question.
possible. So does it still have to be potential to happen, or in that field of possibility, but all those possibilities are happening at the same time?
That's a fascinating question. I mean, within the framework of that experiment, you were saying the cat can be both dead and alive, but it can't be a rabbit within the framework of that experiment. And I think that is an absolute wonderful observation. You know, there's a book that we were talking about last week called The Kybalion, which is a modern iteration of certain Hermetic ideas. And in that book, the writer who uses the name Three Initiates, who was William Walker Atkinson, a brilliant New Thought philosopher, talks about creation occurring along the lines of polarity. Courage can be changed into fear. Anger can be changed into joy. Hate can be changed into love, but hate can't be changed into a bologna sandwich. You know, you have to operate along some lines of polarity. I think that that's a precious, precious, precious observation. I think Neville would probably say that we do exist, or I would certainly say, within a certain cosmic framework where there are certain happenings and occurrences that seem to be ground rules for whatever educative role we play in this world. Mortality is a ground rule. There's never been an exception to it that anybody can produce in any satisfying empirical way. So we are going to face a cosmic framework in which these bodies, for example, decay, as the psalmist says, ye are as gods, but shall die as princes. Neville interpreted that to mean you will die to your coarse, unaware nature of who you are, and thus be resurrected in the New Testament. And I venerate that, and I honor that, and I respect that. At the same time, there are also going to be physical afflictions, decline, mortality, natural events that I don't think are attributable to the state of consciousness, for example, of a group of people somewhere. I do believe that one can experiment with and believe in the question of the mind's ultimate dominion, and yet also acknowledge that we live under many laws and forces that are going to condition what we experience, just as the law of gravity is consistent but felt differently on Earth than it is on the moon, because there's also a law of mass. And I think students of Neville, and I certainly have tried, must grapple with that, It's not sufficient to always speak in generalities, particularly about things that we haven't experienced. I don't want to hear somebody talk about a catastrophe or a war or a natural disaster who has not experienced those things. Let the person who's experienced those things teach me about them. But I don't want to hear from someone who hasn't been through a war as to the metaphysical backstory of why a war occurred. I want to hear those insights from the individual who's gone through it, because empiricism is really the only, inner empiricism is really all that we have on the path. So I think you're getting at something very important, which is the question of what physical framework, if any, do we live under that would prevent the cat, for example, from turning into a rabbit, even though we're presented with an extraordinary possibility in the notion of something being simultaneously dead and alive. You going to say something else?
Well, anything being possible.
Yeah.
This is A or B, kind of, not
Yeah.
A through Z.
And I think Neville would also say, though, that if one focuses upon something, there would be a period of gestation and unfolding events, a field of selection that might go beyond the equation that's presented to us as a given. His contention was that since all states and possibilities are infinite, the very fact that you could even think of this transforming into that, he would probably say is indicative of its reality because you're capable of conceiving it. The question of whether you would want to conceive of it, the question of the gestation period, the question of what would be involved may be very long and drawn out and complex, but he would suggest that your very conception is affirming that that exists. Anybody else? I think, hey.
Hi. I just wanted to talk and ask a question about just an interesting and surprising experience that I had over the course from last week.
Please.
Experimenting this week, which is that I found that it really aggravated my imagination and a kind of feedback loop in which my thoughts were more active and I was sleeping a lot less and didn't have to sleep as much, so it was okay. But another thing that I noticed was that I had a mindfulness meditation practice, like an insight meditation practice, where, you know, a big aspect of it is that you're supposed to kind of sit with what is like the bare bones of reality, and I suddenly found it very difficult because I felt like I was approaching this thing that was kind of antithetical to that.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you think they're opposed, or if there's a way to kind of like synthesize those two ideas.
You know, I so appreciate that question. You're asking, you were doing a mindfulness meditation that requires you to face what is, and here this philosophy seems to be encouraging you to look towards the mountaintops and ask what could be, and are those two at odds? Is there a synthesis? I can't tell you what a wonderful question I find that, and it's a question that I harbor myself. And I was very moved as you were asking that. I believe, and there's simply no way to answer this without somebody feeling that a beloved philosophy or point of view is being questioned or misunderstood or come at in the wrong way, but I can only tell you what my experience is. And I write about this in a book that I have coming out next year called The Miracle Club. I think that ideas of non-attachment and non-identification for the Western seeker, for the modern seeker in any part of the world, have been misunderstood and misserve us. And I made a personal decision a long, long time ago that I believe in human aspiration, and I believe in the holiness and the sacredness of that which you and I and all of us are striving for. And I believe very deeply and seriously that we are expressing the most extraordinary and natural parts of ourselves when we are in the state of becoming and reaching towards something. I don't speak of or make distinctions of, in my own life or in the lives of others, inner, outer, essence, personality. I think we can twist ourselves into pretzel knots by trying to analyze what's coming from where. I think that there is a holiness in the seeking and the fulfillment of one's potential. And Neville would talk about going into a state of meditation where you have an experience of yourself as unconditioned being. And then once you have that experience of yourself as a kind of faceless, unconditioned being, from there you could formulate the stuff of creation. So I think there must be a bridge and a connection and a point of intersection between every philosophy that is true. Truth has to be consistent. So that may be a bridge between a mindfulness practice, for example, and Neville's practice, being in this state of just unconditioned awareness. And then, from that state, if you so choose, exercising your own creative abilities and potentials. But I came to Neville's teaching because I came to believe that there is something truly, truly sacred and noble and right in the issuance of our creations in the world. And I think that you can do all kinds of practices that bring you into a greater state of awareness as an individual. But when I found myself sort of in that same situation that you just described, I guess my sense of personal outcome was one of choosing life, aspiration, expression as something that was not an attachment, but that was holiness itself. So we're going to wrap up. Thank you guys so very, very much, and I'll stick around a little bit. Thank you.